Welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. Now, if you've ever wondered about the future of our housing markets or the prospects for Australian property investment, or maybe you're just curious about how life's going to change now post-pandemic, how it's going to shape our cities, then today's episode is one you simply can't afford to miss. With me today is Lailani Burra, the CEO of .id, sometimes called Informed Decisions. Now, her team's just drummed a bombshell of a report that's going to shake up how we think about investing, about living, and planning our cities for the next 25 years. We're talking about 7.4 million more Australians, 2 million new homes, and a seismic shift back to urban living, all by 2041. This is the future unfolding before our eyes, and today we're going to give you the inside track. So, let's take a deep dive into what Australia is going to look like for decades to come. Let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Welcome, Lailani.
Hello, Michael. Nice to be here.
Now, to give us some context about the discussion we're going to have, maybe you could start off with telling us a little bit about ID, Informed Decisions, please, Lailani.
Absolutely. Well, ID, we sometimes get called .id as per our logo, but ID actually does stand for Informed Decisions. And our purpose is to provide an evidence base to organisations making local or location-based decisions. So we're a spatial company. We collect information about macro changes that are happening in the population and in the economy, and then we interpret what that means for local areas, and we provide an evidence base for people making decisions, whether that be governments or investors or people providing infrastructure, people providing services like aged care services, childcare services, emergency services, etc., all require information about when and where to locate those services. So we provide the evidence base that sits behind those decisions.
I think that's fantastic because I believe demographics is going to drive our destiny, particularly in the property markets. And you recently released a report forecasting what's ahead for Australia's population growth over the next 2 decades. And you released, I guess, what some people would even suggest, some bombshells. So maybe you could tell us, what were your findings?
Well, I guess the big headline number was that the population is forecast to grow by 7.4 million to 2041, and in fact by about 9.2 million to 2046. So we're talking about sort of passing the 30 million mark in sort of 10 years' time, and we're talking about 420,000 additional people in Australia every year. So that's the big headline number. But within that, what we identified is that the COVID-inspired perceived rush to the regions is over, and that 2/3 of Australia's population growth in the next 2 decades will be concentrated in the 4 big cities of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth.
Well, that's just getting back to the old way we used to live, isn't it? So that's a huge percentage of the population. So if we say there's just over 26.5 million people in Australia currently, and that took us over 200 years to get there, you're suggesting our population is going to increase by just under a third over the next 20 years. That's going to require probably another 2 million dwellings in our 4 major capital cities. And your suggestion is it's the 4 big cities that are going to have the concentration, or the 4 big capitals, and then within that it's going to be the cities that are going to have the main concentration of population. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So we're forecasting that 93% of that population growth will happen into the states that house the 4 big cities, and 67% of that growth is going to go into the 4 big capitals. Yeah.
Now, we're talking big numbers. It's sometimes hard for people to understand. But if you said there's going to be 420, 450 100,000 new people every year. That's sort of the equivalent of adding a Canberra to our cities every year. So that's going to make a big difference. And I'd like to unpack that in a moment. But you also made the interesting comment that it's going to get back to urban growth rather than regional areas. What do you think's driving that? Back to the cities.
Back to the cities. So we're not saying that our regions won't grow at all, but we're saying that the majority of growth will be in the cities, which, as you point out, is a return to sort of business as usual in a sense, pre-COVID. And I think there was a sense that there might be a regional renaissance after COVID, and we saw there was an interest in people moving to the regions. But actually, when you unpack it, most of Australia's growth is driven by net overseas migration. So people coming to Australia from overseas, we're a migration nation. And migrants coming to Australia are generally people they're skilled migrants and they're students. And so they're looking for work and study opportunities, and those things largely exist within our big cities.
And it's, I guess, a snowballing effect too, because if more people are there, they're going to require more services. They're going to require a lot of infrastructure as well. Mm-hmm, but how do you see this then shaping our capital cities over the next 20 years? Because clearly your clients for .id are state governments, local governments and providers. If a visitor comes back in 20 years' time, what are they going to see?
It's a really good question, and I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is understanding exactly where that population will go. And the way in which we do that is to unpack where housing will be built. And I think a lot of your listeners will be very interested in that. So to understand where the population will go, you have to understand housing and where a house will be built, because a person needs to live in a home. And so we spend a lot of time looking at where all current dwellings are and then where future dwellings will be built over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And we do that at a very granular level so that we're understanding what's zoned, what the demand is for particular areas, and then what's likely to be built over those time periods. And what we do in that process is we unpack what the likely future will be based on everything we know now and on current zoning and current patterns. And so what we're really saying is there will be growth throughout our cities, but that unfortunately the majority or a very large proportion of that growth is going to be an outward spread into the outer growth areas. And in some cases, we're identifying growth happening as far as 60 to 80 kilometres from the city centre.
That's going to have its own challenges, isn't it? Now, when we grow with so many people, a lot of people think, we need a lot more infrastructure. And when we talk infrastructure, they talk about roads and transport. But in fact, we need the soft infrastructure as well, don't we? So if you've got so many people coming in, the schools, the hospital, the aged care, we're also going to need, I guess, different type of accommodation. We know the government's got a plan. I'm not sure it's actually a plan. It's a discussion that we're going to build 1.2 million properties in the next 5 years. The government's not going to build any of them. So we've got to actually get a way of getting private developers to do that. But do you see a shift in the housing types, the sort of accommodation, if we're going to be accommodating so many more people, Lailani?
Yeah, so our forecasts assume a range of housing types. And overall, there will have to be a shift to higher density forms to accommodate the level of growth that we're talking about. And that will not just be in the inner cities, but also in the growth areas on the fringe, starting to see more densification there. You know, these areas are starting to see some increases of densities, particularly in outer Sydney, and that's being driven partly from affordability and also partly from an environmental perspective, in that Sydney has less availability of sort of flat open space to spread into.
Sure. So Victoria seems to have a bit of extra space in all directions to be able to grow. Sydney's more geographically bound. And last century, I guess we did have a lot of urban sprawl. That's the way our cities grew. We've got to become more dense, don't we? We can't keep growing that way.
No, we can't. It's a difficult one when we're forecasting it. When we're delivering our forecasts, we're forecasting based on sort of known knowns, if you like. And it requires a big shift to change the way in which we develop our cities. We're going to need to see some real leadership in terms of examples of how to increase density in the middle rings of our cities and provide the kind of housing that we're going to need into the future. And even in the outer growth areas where we're used to, putting single form dwellings into those growth areas, we're going to need to look at ways in which we can provide a whole range of different dwelling types so that you get a much more mixed population in there, and particularly in terms of age structure. As we age into the future, we're going to need houses for people with different requirements than we have today.
That'll be interesting because, of course, there's the NIMBYs who are saying not in my backyard, and the note's not over there either. So when you see other big cities around the world, particularly in Europe, you'll find a lot of these medium density dwellings, apartment buildings, whole blocks of them close to the CBD. Bit hard to do now that we've already built quarter-acre blocks around Australia, that people are going to have to amalgamate those. But clearly our cities are going to look very different, just like they are very different from 10 years ago.
No, they are. They're evolving all the time. And we'll find that climate change also has a part to play in that as we find that we need to live more densely. And I think there's something about the way in which we talk about housing, and the fact that housing, a home is not a house. It's a whole set of infrastructure, the soft and the hard infrastructure around people. And a lot of that infrastructure exists in the middle ring and inner areas of our cities. It already exists there. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to create more homes in those parts of our cities.
Well, the importance of neighbourhood really came home over COVID, didn't it? When that third place where you go for recreation or for sport or for education became very important. I don't think us, particularly from Melbourne, where we were locked down for so long, are going to forget that very quickly.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned the end of the regional renaissance, as your study called it. Are there any particular regional areas you think are going to suffer more, or others that are going to hold up well with this demographic shift back to our cities?
We're starting to see migration to Queensland slowing, for example, and a returning to more of a pre-COVID paradigm. In regions around Melbourne and Sydney, we're seeing there is sort of resumption of young people leaving the regions for metropolitan areas, where they're seeking the bright lights, the education opportunities and the work opportunities. And areas that would be more effective would be regional areas where prices have risen to an extent that they're no longer more affordable than many metro regions. So if you look at some parts of Geelong versus Western Melbourne, for example, we're finding that the affordability gap is narrowed. So places in Armstrong Creek, that big growth area out towards the coast there, is now more expensive than places in Wyndham, for example. And so that will have an impact on people's decisions.
Very much so. Sure. So there is going to be a change. And I guess we are going to continue the hybrid work model, but people are seeming to be required to go to the office at least 2 or 3 days a week, and a long trip's going to make it very difficult.
I think there was an important point that perhaps is not well understood, is that part of the reason the regions grew during the COVID period was not actually that people moved there, because if you remember, we were locked down. It was actually that people didn't leave. So those places are not used to having sort of net loss of young people to the cities, and those people couldn't leave to go to the cities. And so it looked as if the population grew, but in fact it was a temporary effect of people not being able to leave.
Yes, I remember reading that in one of your blogs along the way, so that really, why would you leave regional Victoria to go to the city that was all locked down when you had more freedom in the country town? So that makes a lot of sense. There was also a move to Tasmania a while ago. Hobart was the darling of property investors a while ago. For the last couple of years, it's actually underperformed the capital cities. You mentioned Tasmania is likely to face a demographic imbalance problem in your report, while you said the Sunshine Coast actually going to see a boom. Can you maybe delve into these contrarian trends a little bit more?
So what we were looking at in Tasmania is, you're right, there's been a lot of talk about the kind of Tasmanian growth over the last few years, but these places all rely on migration for their growth. they're places that actually rely on migration internally from within Australia. They're not driven by overseas migration. And so Tasmania its biggest trend is to lose its young adults to the major cities of the mainland. And again, post-COVID, this is resuming. So in that sense, it functions in a similar way to a regional or rural area. And then the migration going the other way tends to be in the older age groups. So overall, that results in an aging population in Tasmania with fewer people of working age to support those of retirement age. Up in Queensland, we were really contrasting the Sunshine Coast to the Gold Coast. So the Sunshine Coast attracts significant migration from within Australia. And again, similar to Tasmania, much of that's in retirement age groups. Whereas on the Gold Coast actually does attract an overseas migrant population. And so while there is an aging in place, that's counteracted by younger people coming into the area. So it acts more like a city in a sense than the Sunshine Coast does. So all these regional effects are really interesting to observe, and each place, has its certain role and function that it's playing in terms of who it houses, and it's really understanding that enables us to make these predictions.
Now, I'm going to spend a bit more time explaining where people can get this information down the track, but I know that you've got great information on your website, id.com, so there's a lot of great information there, and I'll leave a link in the show notes so people can get that. You break it down to a suburb level. I guess this is the sort of information you're putting together for your clients, but giving an element of it for free to the public, which I really appreciate. Now, a moment ago we talked about infrastructure and the requirement for that. There's clearly some shortages already showing up. Do you see any particular areas, any areas that are critically requiring attention for this huge urban population influx to the 4 big capital cities?
Yeah, I think we would really advocate for major heavy rail projects. When we're doing forecasting, where we will put population is impacted by certain types of infrastructure, and rail projects have a big impact on densification of housing around railway stations and so on. And so they do have an impact on where the population will go in future. Rail infrastructure in our major cities is still suffering from years of neglect, and there's been little progress in delivering fast rail to sort of nearby centres, Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, Melbourne, Geelong, Ballarat. I mean, these things should be a priority.
We can't even get a rail to our airport in Melbourne at the moment. That was pulled away.
That's exactly right. And, cities such as Perth and Sydney have invested in rail in recent years, and so there's more that can be done to cater for new population growth as well as for existing unserviced populations in terms of rail. And I think much of the challenge is going to be bringing employment to the new forecast growth areas. So, limiting the need for large-scale commuting, which is a well-known challenge, for example, in Western Sydney, where you have the squinter problem of people spending hours in their cars heading into the city centre for work.
The upside is they can listen to my podcast on the way.
That is true.
but I don't think it makes up for being in the car for so long.
And actually, we run a national livability survey. One of the provision of reliable, efficient public transport is considered critically important to metropolitan Australians when they're asked to rank the attributes that make somewhere a good place to live. The people in inner city obviously report significantly better local area experiences of reliable public transport than people in middle suburban or outer suburban areas. So, we really believe that investment in hard rail infrastructure, improved service frequency, reliability bus services would actually critically important to advancing quality of life for Australians in our cities.
Well, having the infrastructure there, having them run efficiently. My wife Pam and I were lucky enough to just have a 3-week holiday in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago. And boy, do those trains run efficiently, right on time. We're actually on a public bus for one little trip, and the bus driver had an iPad next to him which showed where he was on his route, and it showed +1, -1 where he was time-wise, that he had to be exactly on time for the people as well. So there are ways of making in big cities public transport efficient, and if it is, and cheap and convenient and safe, people will use it, won't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, in Melbourne, we believe the metro tunnel is a good example to follow, because it creates new network capacity, it creates new stations. The stations are positioned to enable you to access health, education, arts precincts. It's going to increase frequency and reliability on the existing metro network. So there are some examples that are coming through now.
I guess we're also going to need more schools, more universities, more hospitals, more aged care facilities. Lots of challenges. Hopefully our planners and our politicians will be up to it. You mentioned a little while ago also about climate change. Are there any environmental considerations in your forecast, considering the increasing focus at the moment on sustainable living and construction that's going to fit in with that?
So where it impacts our forecast is understanding what land is available for development. We're finding in some places, Lismore is a good example, that there is now land which is no longer considered suitable for development. And there are other places where fire risk is such that it's no longer considered suitable for development. So where I think Australia, has long been considered sort of this wide brown land that's kind of open for development, we're finding that there are more and more restrictions on places that are appropriate for that development. And so we do reflect those things in our forecast as that becomes known. Yeah.
Now, again, your forecasts rely very heavily on overseas migration, and it seems that both sides of our government, both big political parties, believe migration is a critical part of our future. They've got a business plan to increase our population to 40 million people or so by the middle of the century. Do you see any particular changes in that, any changes in immigration policies that may affect your projections?
Not really. Australia is historically a migration nation. We have high levels of migration. We need that migration, partly because we're an aging population, so we need younger people to come in to Australia to take up particular jobs and to support those of us that are getting older. And I think it's an expectation that that will continue. That's part of Australia's sort of business model, if you like. So we believe governments will continue to use migration policies to address labour shortages, to ensure the economy continues to function effectively. And I think shifts in migration policy are less likely with regard to government policy, but more to do with the relative performance of the Australian economy. So as long as the Australian economy is performing well, that we're a safe and secure and democratic country to come to, we're going to be very attractive for overseas migrants.
I think we are going to be very attractive, and people are suggesting that maybe we shouldn't have as many migrants coming in, but somebody's going to have to pay for the aged care facilities and the pensions, because a lot of people moving into retirement don't have big superannuation for various reasons, including the baby boomers didn't have access to superannuation in their early working years. So either the locals who are here are going to have to pay more taxes to support the government. We know at the moment the government coffers are creaking. There's not enough money for the health care and for disability care and aged care. So either the locals are going to have to pay more, or we're going to have more people in paying the taxes.
Look, we did a very interesting project once in one area in Melbourne where we looked at what would happen if we didn't have any migration and any further development in that particular area. It's very interesting to observe what happens if you don't have any young people coming in. Then basically you have an aging in place situation where you start to lose your schools, you start to lose your preschools, you start to lose services that are there to support younger people. And so you get a suburban lifestyle which ends in sort of a very monoculture or mono age structure, if you like. And that's just not desirable in terms of creating a vibrant and healthy and sustainable community. So I think that's not always well understood, but when you run the numbers, you quickly see that. And when we share those with communities that may have concerns about, densification of housing in their areas, it really can change the conversation to being one about what is a sustainable community and what kind of mixed housing stock do we need in our areas to create that vibrant and sustainable type of community with good services for everybody.
Well, if people are wondering, can Australia sustain this? We make our money as an economy by growing things and selling things to overseas, by digging things out of the ground and selling them, or by selling our education in many ways. And we've got a huge population around us, and maybe not China as much, but if you look at Southeast Asia, of people moving into the middle class. So it seems like we're going to have a lot of potential clients for our services, which should keep Australia a wealthy nation. And if you believe we are going to remain wealthy, our population is going to grow, jobs are going to grow, that should underpin our housing markets moving forward, Lailani.
Absolutely correct. That's absolutely right, Michael. And I think that's why we need to, have these conversations around, a really strong evidence base about what we want our communities and society to look like as we go into that, that future, which is an optimistic future and one, and a growing scenario for Australia.
I think that's a really important way of finishing off, that it is an optimistic future. We're living in the best country in the world, and despite all the challenges out there, probably the best time in history, and we're now talking about 7.4 million more Australians, 2 million new homes, a seismic shift back to urban living in the next, even less than 20 years. So some exciting times ahead for us. Thank you very much, Lailani, and I'm going to leave a link to your informeddecisions.id's website where people can get lots of information. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Michael. Great to talk to you.
Wow, lots of great information in that chat I just had with Lailani, which is going to give you comfort, or should give you comfort, about the long-term prospects of our property market. Now, if you don't currently subscribe to the show, please just stop for a sec and go to whatever podcast app you're listening to on now and subscribe to the show. So twice a week you get the regular segments from my guests. And while you're at it, after we've finished chatting today, go to podcastbonus.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes so you can get a heap of reports as my way of saying thank you. Now, as I was saying a second ago, there's lots of good news for the property markets. So strategic investors, don't worry too much about what's going to happen to interest rates or the market in the next 6 weeks, or not even the next 6 months. They're really looking to the future. And as you've heard, strong population growth and the increased cost of construction and the fact that we're just not building enough accommodation is going to underpin our property markets. But not all markets will work the same. Some markets are going to strongly outperform others. Our markets are going to be fragmented moving forward. Hey, but that's always been the case. And now we've had month after month of rising house prices. But again, the markets are fragmented. And there's no doubt that the economic and political and financial challenges the world's throwing at us is worrying many would-be home buyers and property investors. So if you're stuck, like many other investors are, you're wondering, should you buy, should you sell, should you just wait in the current market? Why not have a chat with my team at Metropole to find out and discuss your options, have a wealth discovery chat. It's free, so go to metropole.com.au. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through property. And while we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, we're still small enough to care. So go to metropole.com.au and organise an obligation-free chat with my team to understand what your options are, what you should do, or maybe you just want an independent overview of your current portfolio. We're happy to do that. metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share a lesson with you from my late mentor, Jim Rohn, who said that success is easy, but so is neglect. Now, he explained that people often asked him how over a 6-year period he became financially successful, while many people at the time didn't. And Jim's Rohn answer was, the answer is simple. The things I found easy to do, they found to be not easy to do, said Jim Rohn. He said, I found it easy to set goals that could change my life. They found it easy not to. I found it easy to read the books that had affected my thinking and my ideas. They found it easy not to. Jim Rohn said, I found it easy to attend the classes and the seminars and get around other successful people. And they said it probably wouldn't matter. So Jim Rohn said, if I had to sum it all up, I'd say that I found it easy to do. They found it easy not to do. And then he said 6 years later, he became a millionaire, and the others were still blaming the economy, the government, company policies, yet they neglected to do the basics, the easy things. Jim Rohn said, in fact, the primary reason most people don't do well, or don't do as well as they could or they should, can be summed up in one single word: neglect. It's not lack of money. The banks are full of money, said Jim Rohn. It's not lack of opportunity. Jim Rohn explained that as much of the free world is still continuing to offer the most unprecedented and abundant opportunities in the last 6,000 years of recorded history. Jim Rohn said it's not the lack of books. The libraries are full of books and they're free. It's not the schools. The classrooms are full of good teachers. We have plenty of ministers, leaders, counsellors and advisors. Jim Rohn said, everything we would ever need to become rich and powerful and sophisticated is within our reach. Well, today I'd be adding to that. There are podcasts and YouTube videos and blogs. Remember, Jim Rohn passed away a number of years ago, and he taught these lessons many, many years ago when I was just starting and learning to become financially independent. So Jim Rohn taught me that neglect is like an infection. He said, left unchecked, it'll spread throughout the entire system of disciplines and eventually lead to a complete breakdown of potentially joy-filled and prosperous human life. Jim Rohn said, not doing the things we know we should do causes us to feel guilty, and guilt leads to an erosion of self-confidence. And he said, as our self-confidence diminishes, so does the level of our activity. He was saying it's a downward spiral. And he said, as our activity diminishes, our results inevitably decline. And as our results suffer, our attitude begins to weaken. And as our attitude begins to slowly shift from positive to negative, our self-confidence diminishes even more. And it goes on and on. Well, Jim Rohn then said his suggestion is, when given a choice of easy to or easy not to, that you don't neglect to do the simple things. You don't neglect to do the basics, the easy, but potentially life-changing activities and disciplines. Now, that's a good lesson from Jim Rohn. In fact, you've often heard me say in these podcasts that you should do the hard things today to have an easy life later. But a lot of people choose to do the easy things now to have a hard life later. Well, that's almost the opposite of what Jim Rohn said, because he said do the easy things. But I guess successful people find those things that others find hard, they find them easy to do. They've learned delayed gratification. They understand that success is easy. You've just got to do what you've got to do to get there. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?